For those who don't know, I'm a freelance photographer, and in recent years, I've started taking expeditions to abandoned places and deserted areas. My idea was to capture places forgotten by time, where nature has taken over or humans have left marks that never fade. Earlier this year, I decided to go to Pripyat in the Chernobyl exclusion zone, looking for some raw images, something no one else had. I was fascinated by the city's hospital. The building seemed like a macabre time capsule, where the marks of the disaster were still almost frozen in place. It was surreal to see all that, and as soon as I entered, I felt a strange anxiety, as if I was being watched in the very first minutes. But I ignored it. We always hear some stories, but in the end, I just wanted my photos. As soon as I entered, the old, damp smell of the building hit me hard. The hospital was filled with narrow corridors, with half-open doors that seemed to hide secrets, patient files still on the counters, rusty medical equipment, and, worse, children's toys piled up in the corners of the rooms. I had been inside for about 20 minutes when I started hearing faint but convincing noises, like light footsteps echoing off the cement floor. I thought it might be an animal, maybe a rat. But when I stopped walking, the noise stopped too. I kept going down the main corridor, trying to ignore it, focusing on finding good shots, but the feeling that I wasn't alone was so intense that my chest started to feel heavy. While walking, I noticed some dark stains on the walls. At first, I thought it was just mold or rust from the humidity, something normal for a place abandoned for so long. But these stains were different. They had an almost viscous look, and the strangest part was that they seemed to change shape when I looked away. I kept ignoring it until I reached a room with wheelchairs lined up. When I raised the camera to take a picture, I swear I heard a whisper, very low, like a plea for help coming from some corner of that room. I put down the camera, listening more closely. Nothing. You know when it feels like your ear picks up something, but it's so subtle you doubt yourself? That was exactly it, but the atmosphere became even heavier after that whisper. I kept walking, but with the feeling that voice might come back at any moment. My hands were starting to sweat, and every time I aimed the camera, it felt like the viewfinder got darker, as if something was approaching from behind me. I even turned around to see if there was anything there, but the corridor was empty. It was as if the hospital was a living entity, muffling sounds and creating this suffocating tension. I decided to head upstairs, and as I climbed the stairs, I felt an intense chill that made me hesitate. It was at that moment I heard, clearly, someone saying, "Help." This time, it was a female voice, weak and drawn out, almost like a painful moan. I froze in the middle of the stairs, trying to figure out where that voice was coming from. There was no one with me. I was sure of it. And yet, the sound was clear, resonating through the corridor as if coming from the walls. Every part of my instinct told me to leave, but my curiosity was stronger. I pointed my flashlight and went up, trying to track where that plea for help might have come from. When I reached the second floor, the air felt thicker, harder to breathe, as if the place was consuming the oxygen. And then I saw something that made me tremble. There were handprints on the walls, as if someone had dragged their fingers through the dust, forming paths leading to one of the rooms. I entered slowly and noticed that the room seemed to have been a sort of children's ward. There were small beds, each with blankets piled up, and among them, some toys. Rag dolls, plastic cars, all scattered in a strange way, as if they had been abandoned in a hurry. With each step I took, the floor creaked, and I started to feel a strong metallic smell, almost like rust mixed with something rotten. That's when, in the corner of the room, I saw something moving. It looked like a shadow, a dark stain stretching along the wall. It seemed to pulse, and at that second, I swear I heard a sigh, like someone was there, trapped within that bizarre, living thing. My entire body went tense, but it was as if my legs wouldn't obey the impulse to run. I couldn't stop looking at that shadow that seemed to writhe on the wall. It didn't have a defined shape, but the way it moved gave the impression something was trying to break free from it. Suddenly, the temperature dropped in a way that made me shiver, and my breath started coming out in clouds. Then, I heard the same whispered voice again, this time closer, practically next to my ear. It was a faint help, like someone barely having the strength to beg. I looked around, the flashlight trembling in my hand, but the room remained empty, just me and that thing on the wall. For a moment, I thought I had lost my mind. Was the tension, the place, and the silence making me imagine things? But before I could convince myself of that, a bed in the opposite corner of the room started creaking as if something had climbed onto it. My heart raced, and I felt my body freeze. The bed began to move slightly, from side to side, the mattress sinking as if supporting the weight of something invisible. The flashlight started flickering, and in the dim light, I saw the outline of a small body on the bed, something that shouldn't be there. That form was enough to make me want to run out, but when I tried to step back, it felt like my feet were glued to the floor. It was as if the air around me was too heavy, keeping me from moving. I could only stand there, watching that shadow take shape. The thing on the bed looked like a child lying on its side, curled up, and with every flicker of the flashlight, I could see the outline better, as if someone, a small child, was there trying to sleep. The worst part was that I started to hear a kind of murmur, a child's voice, as if calling someone. I couldn't make out what it was saying, but it sounded like a kind of lament. Then my flashlight went out for good. And in the dark, the silence became absolute. Only the sound of my own heartbeat remained. But then, something cold touched my arm, like an icy hand holding me. I jumped back, pulling my arm, and managed to turn the flashlight back on, pointing it straight to where I had been before. The bed was empty. That thing, or child, or whatever it was gone. But in the corner of the room, the shadow continued, crawling along the wall and getting closer, as if trying to reach me. I finally managed to move, and without thinking twice, I left the room, nearly stumbling. My mind was a whirlwind of panic and confusion, trying to figure out if I had really seen that or if I was hallucinating. But I didn't have time to think much because as soon as I stepped into the corridor, I began to hear footsteps behind me, as if someone was following me. They were light steps, almost childlike, echoing on the hospital's cement floor. I turned around several times while walking, but only saw the empty corridor stretching out in both directions. The problem was that each time I stopped to look, the footsteps also stopped. When I resumed walking, the footsteps returned, following me. The strangest part was that instead of finding my way out, it seemed like the corridor was stretching, as if I would never reach the end. My hands trembled so much I almost dropped the flashlight. The light flickered in and out, and for a second, I thought I saw a small figure standing at the end of the corridor, watching me. But when the light flickered back on, there was no one there. I kept walking, repeating to myself that it was just my imagination, a trick of the mind mixed with fear and the heavy atmosphere. But with each step, the feeling of being watched and followed grew stronger. I started to pick up my pace, but the feeling of being followed was so strong that every few steps, I looked back. The flashlight kept failing, and each time it flickered back on, it seemed to illuminate faces in the walls, deformed faces that disappeared as soon as I tried to focus on them. I reached a point where the corridor split in two, and the indecision only heightened my desperation. I remember turning left when I entered, so I chose the same direction, trying to stay calm. But just after turning, I smelled that metallic, rotten smell again, even stronger. It seemed to cling to me, and I started feeling nauseous. That's when I heard that whisper one last time, much closer, like it was practically inside my head. Someone was repeating help in a drawn-out, desperate way. And then I saw it. The same dark shadow as before, almost like a humanoid blur, was there in the corridor between me and the exit. It seemed more solid now, with elongated arms stretching across the walls. It didn't move, just stared at me, and I felt the air grow so heavy I thought I might faint. In a last act of desperation, I closed my eyes, turned around, and started running down the other corridor, not looking back and with only one thought in my head, to get out of there as fast as possible. I ran without stopping, hearing those footsteps echoing behind me, quick and erratic, as if someone was trying to catch up to me. The corridor seemed endless, and all I could think was to keep the flashlight on and not trip over anything. My chest burned from breathing so hard, the air felt thick, filled with something that made me feel sick. With each step, the sound of the footsteps behind me grew louder, and I started to hear a sort of sobbing mixed with help, like a child whimpering close to my ear. I even shouted for it to leave me alone, but all I got was an even more suffocating silence, followed by a cold shiver down my spine. Finally, I spotted a sliver of natural light coming from a window at the end of the corridor. That gave me the last bit of strength to keep going. When I got close, nearly tearing my clothes on the debris, I leapt out through the window without thinking twice, landing on the cold, damp ground outside the hospital. The silence outside was almost surreal, and when I looked back, the building looked empty and dead as always, with no sign of movement. To this day, I don't know what I saw in there or if it was real, but after that night, I never managed to return to Pripyat, and I doubt I'll ever have the courage to set foot there again.